In 1799, French soldiers discovered the Rosetta Stone and unlocked the secrets of ancient Egyptian writing. Or did they? Because right now, in museums and temples across Egypt, there are hieroglyphs that make even the world's leading Egyptologists shake their heads in confusion. Symbols that appear nowhere else in the entire Egyptian language. Messages that seem to reference things that shouldn't exist. And inscriptions that, despite 2 centuries of study, remain as mysterious today as they were when Napoleon's scholars first laid eyes on them. Today, we're diving into Egypt's most baffling hieroglyphic mysteries. Messages from the ancient world that refuse to give up their secrets. And what these strange symbols might tell us about a side of ancient Egypt that history books don't want to acknowledge. I'm your host, and this is Pharaoh's Legacy. Before we explore the hieroglyphs that nobody can read, we need to understand something crucial about Egyptian writing itself. Because the story of how we learn to read hieroglyphs is far more complex and incomplete than most people realize. When Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the code of hieroglyphs in 1822 using the Rosetta Stone, the academic world celebrated. Ancient Egypt could finally speak to us again after nearly 2 millennia of silence. Books were translated. Temple walls were read. The mystery was solved. Except it wasn't. Not entirely. Here's what they don't tell you in history class. The Rosetta Stone is written in 3 scripts: hieroglyphs at the top, Demotic in the middle, and Ancient Greek at the bottom. It's essentially the same decree written 3 times. Champollion used the Greek version as a key to unlock the hieroglyphs. Brilliant, right? But here's the problem. The Rosetta Stone dates to 196 BCE, near the very end of ancient Egyptian civilization. By that point, hieroglyphic writing had been evolving for over 3,000 years. 3,000 years? Imagine trying to understand modern English using only a text from the year 1025 AD as your reference point. You'd get some of it right, sure, but you'd also miss thousands of words, slang terms, cultural references, and contextual meanings that evolved over a millennium. That's essentially what Egyptologists are working with. The Rosetta Stone gave us the framework, the basic grammar, and many common words. But it's far from a complete dictionary of a language that spanned 3 millennia. And here's where it gets interesting. As archaeologists excavated more sites and catalogued more inscriptions, they kept finding hieroglyphs that didn't match anything on the Rosetta Stone symbols that appeared nowhere in the reference texts. Combinations that violated every grammatical rule we thought we understood. At first, scholars assumed these were just scribal errors, ancient typos basically. But as the list of anomalies grew longer, a disturbing possibility emerged. What if there were entire categories of hieroglyphic writing that we simply don't have the keys to decode? Dr. James Allen, former curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, has openly acknowledged this problem. In academic circles, there are entire databases of what they call cryptographic hieroglyphs, unusual writings, and unidentified signs. Symbols that appear in royal tombs, temple walls, and papyri that scholars can identify as hieroglyphs, but cannot definitively translate. The general public isn't aware of this because museums and documentaries prefer to present a narrative of solved mysteries and complete understanding. It's cleaner, more satisfying. But talk to any working Egyptologist off the record, and they'll admit that there are significant gaps in our knowledge. So when you visit a museum and read those confident translations on the plaques next to Egyptian artifacts, remember that many contain educated guesses, contextual interpretations, and in some cases, complete blanks where mysterious symbols appear. Now, let's look at specific examples of hieroglyphs that have stumped experts for decades. And trust me, some of these are absolutely mind-bending. Our first mystery takes us to one of the most controversial documents in Egyptology. And before we go any further, I need to be clear about something. This case is disputed, debated, and dismissed by many mainstream scholars. But the fact that it exists at all, and the questions it raises, make it worth examining. It's called the Thule Papyrus, and according to the story, it was discovered in Cairo in 1933 by Alberto Thule, director of the Vatican's Egyptian Museum. The papyrus allegedly contained hieroglyphic text from the reign of Thutmose III around 1480 BCE, describing something extraordinary. Now, here's where the controversy begins. The original papyrus has never been found. What exists are translations and interpretations made by various researchers, most notably Prince Boris de Raschewilz in the 1950s. He claimed the text described circles of fire in the sky, objects that had no heads but emitted a foul odor, flying discs that shone brighter than the sun, and fish and other creatures falling from the sky. The translation, if accurate, would be describing what sounds remarkably like an ancient UFO sighting. Mainstream Egyptologists have several problems with this. First, the original document cannot be verified. Second, many of the hieroglyphic sequences in the supposed transcription don't follow standard Middle Kingdom grammar third. Some of the vocabulary used in the translation doesn't appear in any other known Egyptian texts from that period. Dr. Edward Ashton of the British Museum examined photographs of the alleged transcription and found significant problems. Several of the hieroglyphic groups appear to be malformed or incorrectly copied. Others use signs in ways that violate established grammatical rules. But here's what makes this case interesting. Even if the Thule Papyrus itself is a dead end, there are other Egyptian texts that describe unusual celestial phenomena that Egyptologists struggle to interpret. The pyramid texts, for example, contain passages describing the king ascending to the sky in what's called a celestial bark, or boat. The descriptions are elaborate and specific, detailing how the pharaoh travels among the stars. Are these purely religious metaphors? Or are they describing something the ancient Egyptians actually witnessed and tried to document in the only language they had? In the tomb of Seti I, there are astronomical ceiling paintings that show constellations and celestial bodies. But among the familiar stars and planets, there are symbols that don't correspond to anything we can identify in the night sky. Egyptologists have labeled them as artistic representations or religious symbols. But what if they were attempting to depict actual objects they observed? The point isn't to jump to conclusions about ancient aliens or advanced technology. The point is that we may be missing layers of meaning in Egyptian texts because we're interpreting everything through our modern understanding and biases. Egyptian hieroglyphs weren't just an alphabet. They were a sophisticated system that combined phonetic sounds, ideograms representing concepts, and determinatives that provided context. A single inscription could be read on multiple levels, literal and metaphorical. When we encounter unusual passages that don't fit our expectations, our tendency is to dismiss them as mythology or religious symbolism. But what if some of these mythological texts were the Egyptian way of recording actual observations and events that they didn't fully understand themselves? This brings us to our next mystery, one that's far less controversial but equally baffling. And this one is absolutely, verifiably real. In the city of Esna, about 60 kilometers south of Luxor, stands a temple dedicated to the ram-headed god Khnum. The temple itself is impressive, but what makes it truly extraordinary are the hieroglyphs covering its walls. Because many of these hieroglyphs don't exist anywhere else in Egypt. I'm not talking about a few unusual symbols. I'm talking about hundreds of unique hieroglyphs that appear nowhere in the standard Egyptian writing system. And despite decades of study, Egyptologists can only partially translate many of the inscriptions. These are called cryptographic hieroglyphs, and they represent one of the most challenging puzzles in Egyptology. The Temple of Esna was built and decorated primarily during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, from around 200 BCE to 250 CE. This was very late in Egyptian history, when the old religion was under pressure from Greek and Roman influence. The priests who created these inscriptions were among the last guardians of traditional Egyptian knowledge, and they wrote in a code that they apparently never expected outsiders to understand. Dr. Christian Leitz of the University of Tübingen has spent years studying the Esna texts. His team has catalogued over 600 different hieroglyphic signs in the temple, when the standard Egyptian hieroglyphic system uses only about 700 signs total. But here's the kicker. Many of the Esna hieroglyphs are unique creations, combinations of standard signs in unusual ways, or completely invented symbols that appear nowhere else. Why would the priests do this? The most common explanation is that they were deliberately making the texts difficult to read, keeping sacred knowledge restricted to initiates who had been taught the secret meanings. But that raises another question. If these were just made-up symbols for secrecy, why are they so elaborate and consistent? The cryptographic hieroglyphs follow patterns. They obey grammatical rules, just not the ones we know. It's as if there was an entirely separate layer of Egyptian writing that existed parallel to the standard system. Some of the Esna texts deal with cosmology and creation myths. Others describe rituals and offerings to the gods. But scattered throughout are passages that scholars simply cannot translate with confidence. One inscription describes a journey through different levels of heaven. Another discusses the nature of time and cycles of creation. There are references to numbers and astronomical observations that don't align with what we know about Egyptian mathematics and astronomy from other sources. Dr. Leitz's team has published multiple volumes attempting to decode these texts, and they've made significant progress. But even they admit that large portions remain uncertain or completely mysterious. Here's one specific example. On the ceiling of the temple, there's an astronomical text that includes unusual hieroglyphs depicting what appear to be celestial objects or events. Some of the symbols resemble standard representations of stars or planets, but combined in ways that don't make sense. One interpretation suggests these might be describing comets or meteors. Another theory proposes they're purely symbolic, representing religious concepts. A third possibility, raised by some researchers, is that they're recording actual astronomical observations that the priests considered significant, but that we can't identify because we don't know exactly what they were looking at or when. The frustrating thing about cryptographic hieroglyphs is that we know they mean something. They're not random. They're not decorative. They were written by educated priests who clearly intended to communicate specific information. We just don't have the full key to unlock it. And Esna isn't the only temple with cryptographic texts. Similar mysterious hieroglyphs appear at Dendera, Edfu, and other late-period temples. Each site has its own unique variations, suggesting that different priesthoods developed their own versions of secret writing. This points to something fascinating about ancient Egypt that often gets overlooked. The Egypt we think we know, the one from textbooks and documentaries, is largely based on sources from the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. But Egyptian civilization continued for another 1,000 years after that, evolving in ways we're only beginning to understand. The late-period priests weren't just preserving ancient knowledge, they were adapting it, elaborating on it, and apparently encoding it in increasingly sophisticated ways. Why? What were they protecting? What knowledge did they consider so important or so dangerous that it needed to be written in code? We may never know the full answers, but the existence of these texts proves that there are entire categories of Egyptian writing and knowledge that remain beyond our grasp. Now, let's look at an even older mystery. One that takes us back thousands of years to a time when hieroglyphs were just being invented. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, there's an object that most visitors walk past without a second glance. It's a stone palette, about 64 centimeters tall, carved on both sides with intricate scenes and hieroglyphs. It's called the Narmer Palette, and it's one of the most important artifacts in all of Egyptology. It's also one of the most mysterious. The Narmer Palette dates to approximately 3100 BCE, right at the dawn of Egyptian civilization. It's believed to commemorate the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under King Narmer, possibly the same person as Menes, the legendary first pharaoh. What makes this palette extraordinary is that it contains some of the earliest hieroglyphs ever discovered. We're looking at the Egyptian writing system in its infancy, just beginning to develop. And that's exactly why it's so hard to understand. On the front of the palette, we see Narmer wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, about to strike an enemy with a mace. Above the enemy is a symbol that most Egyptologists interpret as the name of a defeated region or people. But here's the problem. The hieroglyphs used are so early in the development of writing that we're not entirely sure how to read them. There's a symbol that looks like a bird with human arms holding a rope attached to a human head emerging from the ground. What does that mean? The standard interpretation is that it represents Horus, the falcon god, presenting captives to the king. But that's an interpretation based on later Egyptian religious symbolism. We're reading backwards from what we know about later periods to guess at what these early symbols meant. On the back of the palette, there are two long-necked lions or serpopards with their necks intertwined, creating a circular depression that would have been used for grinding cosmetics. Flanking them are men holding ropes attached to the creatures' necks. Above this scene is another image of Narmer, now wearing the crown of Lower Egypt, reviewing rows of decapitated enemies. And scattered throughout are hieroglyphs that appear nowhere else in the Egyptian language. Dr. Toby Wilkinson of Cambridge University has written extensively about early Egyptian writing, and he emphasizes that the Narmer Palette represents a transitional moment. The symbols on the palette are part hieroglyphic writing and part pictorial narrative. The line between art and text hadn't yet been firmly established. Some of the symbols on the palette are clearly recognizable as hieroglyphs that remained in use throughout Egyptian history. But others are unique to this early period, and their exact meaning is debated. For example, there's a symbol that looks like a catfish combined with a chisel. Most scholars agree this represents the name Narmer phonetically, with the catfish reading as Nar and the chisel as Mer. But this is an educated guess based on comparing it to later name-writing conventions. We can't be absolutely certain that's how it was pronounced or understood at the time. Then there's the scene with the bird-human figures. Are they gods? Are they symbolic representations of the king's power? Are they depicting an actual ritual or ceremony? We're inferring meaning based on context and comparison to later Egyptian art. But the truth is, we're looking at a moment in history where the rules of Egyptian iconography hadn't been fully established yet. Here's what makes this truly frustrating from an Egyptological standpoint. The Narmer Palette is considered one of the foundation documents of Egyptian civilization. It's on display in the most important museum in Egypt. It's featured in virtually every book about ancient Egypt. And yet, significant portions of it remain uncertain or hotly debated among scholars. Dr. Francesco Raffaele, an expert on pre-dynastic Egypt, has catalogued dozens of early inscriptions from this period, and he's found consistent patterns of hieroglyphs that appear in the earliest phase of Egyptian writing, but then disappear or change meaning in later periods. It's as if the earliest Egyptians were experimenting with writing, trying out different symbols and combinations before settling on the standardized system we know from later dynasties. And in the process, they created inscriptions that used hieroglyphs in ways that don't match the later conventions we use to translate them. This has huge implications. If we can't fully understand inscriptions from the very beginning of Egyptian civilization, how much are we missing from later periods? How many texts have we confidently translated based on later linguistic rules, not realizing that they might contain layers of meaning from earlier traditions that don't fit our models? The Narmer Palette is a reminder that ancient Egypt wasn't static. It evolved over 3,000 years. The hieroglyphs of the Old Kingdom weren't identical to those of the Middle Kingdom, which differed from the New Kingdom, which changed further in the late period. Each era added new symbols, changed meanings, and adapted the writing system to new needs. And somewhere in that long evolution, meanings were lost, traditions were forgotten, and texts that once made perfect sense became mysterious even to later Egyptians. Which brings us to perhaps the most baffling hieroglyphic mystery of all. One that's been hiding in plain sight for over a century. If you've spent any time looking at ancient Egypt mysteries online, you've probably encountered images of what looks like a helicopter, a submarine, and a spaceship carved into the wall of an Egyptian temple. These are called the Abydos Helicopter Hieroglyphs, and they've become one of the most controversial symbols in all of Egyptology. They're real. They exist. You can go to the Temple of Seti I in Abydos right now and see them with your own eyes. The question is, what are they? Let's start with the mainstream Egyptological explanation, because it's important to understand the official position before we examine the controversies. The inscriptions in question appear on a lintel beam in the Temple of Seti I, which was built around 1290 BCE. The beam contains a series of hieroglyphs that, at first glance, appear to depict modern vehicles. There's something that looks remarkably like a helicopter with rotors. Next to it is a shape resembling a submarine or blimp. Further along are what appear to be aircraft. The standard explanation is that these are the result of palimpsest. That's a fancy archaeological term for when one inscription is carved over another. Here's what apparently happened. Seti I had hieroglyphs carved into this beam. Later, his son Rameses II had those hieroglyphs filled in with plaster and carved new hieroglyphs over them. Over 3,000 years, the plaster eroded unevenly, exposing parts of both inscriptions at once. The result is that sections of two different sets of hieroglyphs overlap, creating shapes that look like modern objects, but are actually just random combinations of unrelated symbols. Dr. Liam McNamara of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford examined the hieroglyphs in detail and concluded that this explanation fits the physical evidence. When you look closely at the wall, you can see the fill marks where plaster was used. The helicopter shape is actually parts of several different hieroglyphs from two different time periods overlapping. Case closed, right? Just an optical illusion created by eroded plaster and wishful thinking. Except, here's where it gets interesting. While the palimpsest explanation is almost certainly correct for the helicopter itself, it raises another question that Egyptologists don't often address. Why do these accidental combinations look so much like recognizable objects? We're not talking about vague, abstract shapes that could be interpreted as anything with enough imagination. The helicopter image has clear rotors, a tail section, and a body. The submarine shape has a classic elongated profile with a conning tower. These are extremely specific resemblances. Statistically, what are the odds that random overlapping hieroglyphs would create multiple images that all resemble modern machines? It's possible, certainly pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns and familiar objects in random shapes, is well documented. We see faces in clouds, animals in rock formations, and yes, sometimes modern objects in ancient carvings. But here's something that should make us pause. The Temple of Seti I contains thousands of hieroglyphs. Thousands. And yet these specific combinations on this specific beam are the only ones in the entire temple that create such striking resemblances to modern technology. Why aren't there accidental helicopters and submarines all over the temple, if it's just random chance? Dr. Ruth Schumann-Antelmi, a French Egyptologist, has studied the Abydos inscriptions and makes an important point. While the helicopter itself is almost certainly a palimpsest illusion, we shouldn't dismiss the entire phenomenon. Too quickly, Egyptian hieroglyphs were capable of depicting complex machines and devices that the Egyptians actually built: irrigation systems, construction equipment, boats, and chariots. If the ancient Egyptians had witnessed something unusual in the sky, or had knowledge of advanced devices, whether built by them or observed from some other source, they would have depicted those objects using the same hieroglyphic system they used for everything else. The hieroglyphs would look like hieroglyphs because that was their entire system of visual communication. So if they were trying to record seeing something flying, it would look like stylized hieroglyphic birds or sun disks, because those were the symbols they had for things that flew. To us, reading it thousands of years later, it would just look like normal religious symbolism. This is the real mystery of the Abydos helicopter. Not whether it depicts actual ancient aircraft, it almost certainly doesn't. The mystery is whether we're capable of recognizing extraordinary claims in Egyptian hieroglyphs when they're written in a symbolic system we only partially understand. Dr. James Henry Breasted, one of the founding fathers of American Egyptology, wrote something fascinating in his 1912 work, Development of Religion and Thought in Ancient Egypt. He noted that Egyptian religious texts contain passages that seem to describe technologies and processes that shouldn't have been possible with ancient knowledge. But because we interpret everything through a religious lens, we dismiss them as pure mythology. What if some percentage of what we call mythology was actually Egyptian attempts to describe real observations or real knowledge, encoded in religious language, because that was the framework they had available? I want to be absolutely clear here. I'm not arguing for ancient aliens or time travelers. The evidence for those theories is non-existent. But I am suggesting that our understanding of Egyptian hieroglyphs might be less complete than we'd like to believe, and that some texts might contain meanings we're not equipped to recognize because we're reading them through our own biases and expectations. The Abydos helicopter is a perfect example of this. A genuine mystery, the palimpsest, was hijacked by fringe theorists and used to support wild claims about ancient astronauts. In response, mainstream Egyptology dismissed not just the crazy interpretations, but the entire question of what else we might be missing in Egyptian texts. And that brings us to the most troubling category of mysterious hieroglyphs. The ones that might actually be hiding sophisticated knowledge we've overlooked. One of the most overlooked aspects of hieroglyphic writing is that it wasn't just used for religious texts and royal propaganda. The ancient Egyptians used hieroglyphs to record mathematical calculations, astronomical observations, and technical knowledge. And some of those texts contain information that shouldn't be possible with the level of technology we believe they possessed. Let's start with mathematics. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, dating to around 1650 BCE, contains a series of mathematical problems and solutions. Many of them are straightforward, practical calculations for land surveying, construction, and accounting. But scattered throughout are problems that suggest a more sophisticated understanding of mathematics than we typically credit to ancient Egypt. One problem deals with calculating the volume of a truncated pyramid. The method shown in the papyrus is mathematically correct and elegant. But here's the thing. This requires understanding abstract geometric principles that, according to the standard timeline of mathematical development, shouldn't have been formalized for another 1,000 years. Dr. Annette Imhausen of the University of Frankfurt, a specialist in ancient Egyptian mathematics, has written about this disconnect. The mathematical techniques shown in Egyptian papyri sometimes display knowledge that seems out of place for their time period. The explanations work perfectly, but we're not always sure how they arrived at them, or whether they understood the underlying principles the way we do. Then there are the hieroglyphs dealing with astronomy. The Dendera zodiac, a ceiling carving from the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, shows an intricate map of the heavens. It dates to around 50 BCE and depicts constellations, planets, and astronomical events. Mainstream Egyptologists agree it's an astronomical map. What they debate is exactly what it's showing. Some of the symbols clearly represent zodiac constellations that were common knowledge in the Ptolemaic period. But others are unique, hieroglyphic representations that don't match any known celestial objects or events. Dr. Giulio Magli of the Polytechnic University of Milan, an archaeoastronomer, has analysed the Dendera zodiac extensively. His conclusion is that it represents a snapshot of the sky at a specific date, possibly recording an astronomical event that the priests considered significant. But which event? And which date? Various researchers have proposed different interpretations, ranging from the summer solstice to rare planetary alignments, to historical events like the founding of the temple. The problem is that many of the hieroglyphic symbols used in the zodiac are unusual or unique, making it impossible to translate them with certainty. There's a hieroglyph that shows a woman giving birth. Most scholars interpret this as representing the constellation Virgo, or symbolizing renewal and creation. But it appears in a position that doesn't align perfectly with any constellation, leading some researchers to wonder if it's marking something else entirely. Another section shows what appear to be eclipses or unusual celestial events. The hieroglyphs used combine standard astronomical symbols in ways that don't appear in other Egyptian astronomical texts. We can guess at their meaning, but we can't be certain. Here's what makes this particularly frustrating. We know that Egyptian priests were sophisticated astronomers. They tracked the movements of stars and planets with remarkable precision. They predicted the annual flooding of the Nile based on the heliacal rising of Sirius. They aligned their temples and pyramids to celestial events with incredible accuracy. But almost all of the detailed astronomical records they must have kept are lost. What survives are fragments, abbreviated versions, and encoded texts like the Dendera zodiac that assume the reader already has background knowledge we no longer possess. Imagine if all modern astronomical textbooks were destroyed and future archaeologists only had horoscope magazines and decorative star maps to figure out what we knew about the universe. They'd get some of it right, but they'd miss vast amounts of technical knowledge that wasn't recorded in those simplified sources. That's potentially what we're dealing with when we try to understand Egyptian astronomical hieroglyphs. We have the popular versions, the temple decorations and religious texts. But the technical manuals, the detailed observations, the mathematical calculations that must have supported all of this, those are gone. Or are they hidden in hieroglyphs we haven't fully understood? Dr. Kate Spence of Cambridge University made headlines in 2000 when she proposed a new theory for how the Great Pyramid was aligned so precisely to true north. Her theory involved tracking the positions of two stars as they rotated around the celestial pole. It's mathematically elegant and fits the evidence. But here's the catch. There's no Egyptian text that explicitly describes this method. No hieroglyphic manual explaining the technique. Dr. Spence worked it out by reverse engineering the physics and astronomy involved. The ancient Egyptians must have done something like this, but they apparently never wrote it down in a way we've found or recognized. What if they did write it down, but we don't know how to read it? What if some of those cryptographic hieroglyphs in temples like Esna aren't just religious secrets, but technical knowledge encoded in symbolic language? This brings us to one final mystery, one that connects all of these threads together and points to a disturbing possibility about what we might have lost. In ancient Alexandria stood one of the greatest repositories of knowledge the world has ever known, the Great Library of Alexandria. At its height, it contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls covering every subject imaginable: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, literature, and yes, Egyptian religious and historical texts. And then it burned. Not all at once, but gradually, over several catastrophes spanning centuries. Julius Caesar's siege in 48 BCE destroyed part of it. Christian mobs in 391 CE destroyed more. The final collections may have survived until the Arab conquest in the 7th century CE. Regardless of exactly when it was destroyed, the result is the same. An incalculable amount of ancient knowledge was lost forever. And that includes countless Egyptian texts that might have explained the very mysteries we've been discussing. We know from references in surviving texts that the Library of Alexandria housed extensive Egyptian collections. Manetho, an Egyptian priest and historian who lived in the 3rd century BCE, wrote a comprehensive history of Egypt that was kept in the library. His original work is lost. We only have fragments quoted by later authors. The library contained Egyptian astronomical treatises, mathematical texts, medical papyri, and religious documents that were already ancient when they were collected. Imagine what we could learn if we had access to those sources. Imagine how many of these mysterious hieroglyphs might suddenly make sense if we had the reference texts that explained them. But we don't, and we never will. Dr. Okasha L. Daly, an Egyptologist at University College London, has written about the catastrophic loss of Egyptian texts throughout history. It's not just the Library of Alexandria. Christian authorities in late antiquity systematically destroyed pagan texts, including Egyptian religious and scientific works, considering them heretical. Later, during the Islamic period, more texts were lost or destroyed. And long before any of that, ancient Egyptians themselves lost knowledge as their civilization declined. By the Ptolemaic period, many Egyptians could no longer read texts from the Old Kingdom. The language had changed too much. The knowledge was slipping away even before foreign conquest and religious persecution. This is why those cryptographic hieroglyphs at Esna and other late temples are so poignant. The priests who created them were desperately trying to preserve knowledge in a world where traditional Egyptian culture was dying. They encoded their texts, making them difficult to read, hoping that future initiates would be trained to understand them. But there were no future initiates. The temple schools closed, the priesthoods died out, and the keys to understanding those cryptographic texts died with them. We are left with fragments and mysteries, hieroglyphs we can identify but not fully translate, references to texts that no longer exist, technical knowledge that we can see the results of, in the form of aligned temples and precise astronomical calculations, but whose methods are lost. Dr. Edmund Meltzer, an Egyptologist who specialized in Egyptian language, once said something that has stuck with me. He pointed out that every translation of an Egyptian text should come with an asterisk. An acknowledgement that we're working with incomplete information, making educated guesses based on context, and sometimes just hoping we're in the right ballpark. The translations you see in museums and books are the best efforts of brilliant scholars using every tool available. But they're not gospel, they're interpretations, subject to revision as new information emerges. And sometimes there's no new information. Sometimes all we have is a mysterious hieroglyph on a temple wall, a symbol that appears nowhere else, a message from the ancient world that we will never fully understand. The historian Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE, recorded a fascinating detail about Egyptian priests. He said they believed that Thoth, the god of writing and knowledge, had deliberately made hieroglyphs obscure and multi-layered, because sacred knowledge should not be obvious to the uninitiated. Whether or not you believe in divine inspiration, the practical result is the same. Egyptian hieroglyphs were designed to work on multiple levels: surface meanings for the general public, deeper meanings for educated scribes, and innermost secrets for the priesthood. We've recovered the surface level. We can read the basic narrative of most Egyptian texts. We've even penetrated to some of the deeper symbolic and religious meanings. But that innermost level? The secret knowledge that the priests encoded in cryptographic hieroglyphs and mysterious symbols. Most of that is gone, lost to time, catastrophe, and the collapse of the very civilization that created it. So what does all of this mean? What should we take away from these mysterious hieroglyphs that nobody can fully translate? First, and most importantly, it means we should approach ancient Egypt with humility. The confident narratives in textbooks and documentaries, while based on genuine scholarship, are incomplete. There are significant gaps in our knowledge. There are texts we can't fully read, techniques we don't understand, and knowledge that may be lost forever. That doesn't mean we should abandon mainstream Egyptology in favor of wild theories. The scientific method, archaeological evidence, and careful linguistic analysis have revealed enormous amounts of genuine knowledge about ancient Egypt. We know far more about Egyptian civilization now than we did 200 years ago, and research continues to advance our understanding. But it does mean we should stay open to the possibility that we're missing things. That some mysteries might actually be unsolvable with current evidence. That ancient Egyptians might have known and done things that don't fit our models of how civilizations develop. Dr. John Coleman Darnell of Yale University, one of the most respected Egyptologists working today, has emphasized that Egyptian civilization was far more complex and sophisticated than popular depictions suggest. Every new discovery reveals unexpected levels of organization, technical skill, and intellectual achievement. The mysterious hieroglyphs we've discussed today are reminders of that complexity. Each one represents a moment where the ancient Egyptians tried to communicate something important, and we, despite our best efforts, can't quite hear what they're saying. The Tully Papyrus, whether authentic or a hoax, points to a larger truth. Egyptian texts do contain descriptions of celestial phenomena that we struggle to interpret. Are they purely religious symbolism? Natural events described in mythological language? Or something else entirely? We don't always know. The cryptographic hieroglyphs of Esna and other late temples prove that Egyptian priests were still actively creating new forms of writing and encoding knowledge, even as their civilization was in decline. What were they protecting? Why was it so important to hide this knowledge? We have fragments of answers, but not the complete picture. The Narmer Palette reminds us that we're reading Egyptian history backwards, using texts from the end of their civilization to understand the beginning. That's backwards from how any language or culture actually develops, and it means we're likely missing early meanings and traditions. The Abydos Helicopter, despite being almost certainly just an eroded palimpsest, raises the question of whether we're capable of recognizing unusual claims or knowledge in hieroglyphic texts that are written in symbolic language we only partially understand. And the mathematical and astronomical hieroglyphs show us that the ancient Egyptians had technical knowledge that sometimes seems surprisingly advanced or out of place for their era. Whether we're missing something about how they achieved this, or whether our timeline of human intellectual development needs revision, remains an open question. What's the solution? How do we fill in these gaps? More research, obviously, but also more honesty about what we don't know. Instead of presenting ancient Egypt as a solved mystery, we should acknowledge it as an ongoing puzzle with pieces still missing. We need to continue excavating new sites, analyzing texts with modern technology, and training new generations of Egyptologists who might bring fresh perspectives to old questions. We also need to preserve what remains. Climate change, urban development, and tourism are all taking a toll on Egyptian monuments. Every year, more hieroglyphs erode, more context is lost. The cryptographic texts at Esna are particularly vulnerable because they're carved in soft sandstone that's deteriorating rapidly. If we want future generations to have any hope of solving these mysteries, we need to protect and document everything we can while we still can. The hieroglyphs we've explored today represent just a fraction of the mysteries still hidden in Egyptian texts. For every symbol we've discussed, there are dozens more scattered across temples, tombs, and papyri throughout Egypt, waiting for someone to finally understand their meaning. Maybe that someone is watching this video right now. Maybe the next generation of Egyptologists will crack codes that have stumped scholars for centuries. Or maybe some of these mysteries will remain forever unsolved. Messages from the ancient world that we simply lack the context to understand. Either way, these mysterious hieroglyphs remind us why ancient Egypt continues to fascinate us 3,000 years after the last pharaoh ruled. It's not just what we know about Egypt that captivates us. It's what we still don't know. The mysteries that remain. The secrets that refuse to give up their answers. Because as long as there are untranslated hieroglyphs on Egyptian walls, as long as there are symbols whose meanings are lost to time, ancient Egypt will continue to speak to us, whispering riddles across the centuries, challenging us to listen more carefully, to look more closely, and to never assume we have all the answers. The ancient Egyptians built their civilization to last forever. They succeeded in ways they never imagined, not through gold and monuments, but through mysteries that ensure we'll never stop trying to understand them. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Egypt's most mysterious hieroglyphs, make sure to subscribe to Pharaoh's Legacy. We're exploring the hidden history of ancient Egypt, one mystery at a time. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation, and leave a comment below. What do you think these mysterious hieroglyphs represent? Lost knowledge? Secrets the priests deliberately hid? Or just gaps in our understanding that time and research will eventually fill? The ancient Egyptians left us a message. We're still learning how to read it. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, the greatest mysteries are the ones we have yet to solve.